Hello, everybody. I'm happy to introduce a spin off of Sci Fi Pulsi, and that is called Is It Fascist? And this is something I've been wanting to do for a while now. I've just kind of been working on the criteria we're going to use in the calculation. I've just been kind of going back and forth, revising things, adding things in, taking it out. If you want, please comment down below the video. If you think there's anything I should adjust, something I should add, something I should remove, I'm open to suggestions. As with most things, it's a work in progress. So, fascism as a political ideology, I've always found very fascinating, just because it has so many different meanings, and there's so many things that people call fascist or attribute to fascism, and there's always a debate as to whether something is or something isn't. I feel like when you're dealing with communism or even just socialism in general, it's a lot easier to make that determination. With libertarianism, it is. With, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, conservatism, you generally have a pretty good idea of what these terms mean and who fits into this category. Fascism is not like that, though, and I think that's primarily due to it being very much based on whatever the host culture is. So some variants of it are secular, some variants of it are religious, some variants of it are cultural, some variants of it are ethnic, some are racial. It's kind of all over the place, depending very much on the society that grows out of it, that it grows out of, I should say. And it's used as a pejorative all the time. People will just call something this or call something that. So I was thinking, you know what, let's start taking a look at the stuff that people say is fascist and determine if that's really the case. Let's look at it from what I at least consider to be a fairly impartial, empirical viewpoint. Obviously, whenever you're dealing with social science or the humanities or something, there is subjectivity to it. But if you have a process that kind of makes sense and you lay out your biases, I think you can do a pretty good job analyzing things. So what I've done is I've examined a bunch of different fascist movements, my understanding of the ideology as it is, and I've come to put together 12, I guess you could say, characteristics. I don't really think tenets is accurate because it varies so much from, like I said, culture to culture. Like, you can't say fanatical religious devotion, you can't say an obsession with racial purity, because it very much depends on it. So I have a list of like characteristics or tendencies that I think are true of most what we would consider to be fascist movements. And we're going to go through them for whatever we're examining. And if the characteristic applies completely, we will award 1 point. If it somewhat applies or we're not really sure, we'll award half a point. If it really doesn't apply at all, then it gets 0 points. And at the end, we'll see what our score is. And once again, the score at the moment is going to be 10 to 12. Will be fascist, 8 to 9 will be parafascist, and then below that will be non-fascist. And we can adjust that as we go. If I find like everything is getting 10 to 12, I can raise or lower the threshold. It should get better once we've gone through a couple, because there are definitely clear-cut cases in one direction or another. And a couple people were saying, just as they were looking at the list, hey, this could apply to a lot of like socialist governments or absolute monarchies or communist states or things like that. It applies to all these non-fascist governments. Well, that's because there's a lot of overlap. Like, there's a lot of overlap between like a fascist totalitarian society and a communist one. Likewise, there's a lot of overlap between an absolute monarchy and a fascist society, especially when you start to get into something like Bonapartism. So I'll say right now, if we were to take like Juche or national communism under Ceausescu, they would both almost certainly get like 10 to 12 points. But I consider those to basically be more similar to an extreme right ideology than an extreme left ideology. Once again, these terms are all difficult, but hopefully this will make sense. And to make this even more confusing, I have chosen as the inaugural ideology we're going to look at a real world one today. I'm gonna do some real world ones, probably mostly fictional. I want to do the New Order. I want to do the Jaegerists. Maybe Britannia from Code Geass. We'll just play it by air. So we're going to be doing MAGA, or Make America Great Again. We can also call it Trumpism. Uh, it's. I know it's a little bit of a stretch to call it an ideology, but we're going to look at it as a mass movement, as a mass movement within American conservatism and the Republican Party. Because particularly when you start getting into what is normally considered to be totalitarian systems, it gets very difficult to differentiate between party, group, ideology, state, organization. It all kind of blends together. And I guess just kind of one more note before we start. Some of these questions or some of these tenets are put in to try to lower the scores of other things. Like some of these are here so that they don't apply to conservatism, but they apply to fascism, or they apply to socialism, but not fascism. You'll see what I mean. We're going to go through MAGA and we're going to go through my logic in putting these together. So, that being said, let's go forward. The first criteria is an ideologically syncretic mixture of reactionary and conservative positions, as well as revolutionary and progressive ideas. This one I hope is fairly straightforward. Fascism, or is also known as reactionary modernism, because what you have is you'll take often very conservative ideas about gender, often very conservative religious ideas, concepts that you see in traditional Catholicism, such as the organic nation, integral nationalism, that sort of thing. But it'll be combined with like futurism, an emphasis on technology, sometimes kind of like weird radical economic systems, and kind of just dramatic changes in society. You'll often also get a resentment or despising of the conservative establishment or the existing right within the country. So let's take a look at MAGA. Does this apply to MAGA? Now, a lot of people, I think the immediate thing would be, yeah, because they're like conservatives, but they're also these like radical Trumpian populists who are they're revolutionary in that they're shaking up the GOP establishment. They're coming out with all these like crazy things that don't fit into the American conservative movement. And I'm going to have to kind of disagree with it. Like, let's take a look at what are the kind of things that MAGA generally supports. Economic protectionism. That's hardly a new idea. The Republican Party was protectionist at various parts in its history. Its predecessors, the Whigs and the Federalists, were both protectionists. This is something that frequently comes up through American political discourse. It's hardly revolutionary. It's hardly like a completely original idea. Populism's hardly like an original idea, especially when you get into like middle class populism. That's kind of what America was founded on, more or less. And you'll have some sort of populist movement, be it the People's Party or whatever, that shows up every couple decades. And that's once again not that unusual. You can talk about nativism or anti-immigration. That's a debate that's been had in America since basically the country was founded. There's nothing like, if you go through it, we can talk about like Christian nationalism or Christian identity. That's been part of America since forever. I guess like the most radical new thing that MAGA's put forward is like Trump supported sending everybody Trump bucks during COVID. But once again, I guess you could almost say that kind of resembles the negative income tax or something like that. If that's the best you have with regards to it being this kind of revolutionary thing, I'm going to have to say no. So I think it's a fairly and this is kind of hard also with America, because America was a country that was founded on Enlightenment liberalism in a lot of ways. So the conservative tradition within America is to conserve the Enlightenment. It's confusing, but basically, no, I don't think this applies. Number two, identitarian with a clearly defined in-group and out-group, be this cultural, religious, ethnic, or racial. And I mean, if we look at different variants of what would generally be considered fascism, in the case of Brazilian fascism or integralism, it was broadly speaking more cultural and religious. With Bothism, it was cultural and to a certain extent ethnic, however you want to define Arabs. The group is very kind of fluid and flexible depending on the context. Now, this one is slightly confusing because American identity is slightly confusing. I would say that within MAGA, you definitely have American cultural nationalism or an asserting of the American cultural identity and what's generally considered to be traditional American values. You definitely have a conception of Christians as being the core of America or the in group. There is aspects of nativism, or it's not exactly white identitarianism, but there is a nostalgia that pervades a lot of it and the desire to not see the country undergo further demographic transition. So there is kind of a mixture of cultural, religious, ethnic, or racial. It's just not very clearly defined. But I would say it's probably close enough. There's also kind of an ideological dimension to it where they kind of identify liberals as being the other to a certain extent, so we'll give them 1 point for that. A revanchist or romantic nationalist desire to restore the nation to its former glory or avenge itself against a historical foe. I mean, it's kind of in the name. Make America great again. If that isn't it, then I don't know what is. But just to go into maybe a bit more detail, this is things like, restoring Germany to its former glory, rebuilding the Roman Empire. We lost this territory in the previous war. We lost this territory in the Treaty of Trianon. We need to enter the next World War to try to get our land back. So it can kind of be more of a romantic nationalist, kind of like we're going to unite Germany, we're going to restore America to what it was like in the 1950s, or it can be revanchist, where it's based on we got to pay back France for what they did to us previously. So I would say it definitely gets a point in this category. So we're at 2 so far. Okay, number 3. A belief in the supremacy of the party or state. This is a core aspect of fascism. It always tends to be authoritarian. Whether it is party focused or state focused, or if those are the same thing, tends to kind of vary from system to system. It's kind of a similar scenario you get in other types of totalitarian societies. Like, where did the party end in the Soviet Union, and where did the Soviet state and the Soviet bureaucracy begin? It's a determination that's very, very difficult to make. But there is, generally speaking, a belief that the state or the party is, to a certain extent, kind of divine or absolute. Does this apply to MAGA? No. No. MAGA is like came out of a rejection of this principle. I mean, you can argue that they're more populist, that they're not as maybe libertarian as the conservative movement was under Buckley, but does MAGA want like the NSA? Do they want the Patriot Act? Do they want more domestic spying? Do they want the government to control more of the economy? Do they want to pay higher taxes? Do they place total unquestioning faith in the Republican Party? No. This in no way applies, and so MAGA gets a 0 for this category. A conception of an idealized new man. So this is something you see both in communism and in fascism, where there's this idea that we're going to transform people at an individual level into a new man or a new woman that is like a man who's more masculine, a man who's willing to sacrifice, a man who's willing to fight, that we're going to kind of, to a certain extent, change the fundamental character of the people within the nation. Within, I think it's the doctrine of fascism, it says nothing above the state, nothing outside the state. And within that conception of kind of a totalitarian society, you have the new man. In the case of communism, the idea is you have someone who's free from ego and free from selfishness and is willing to work solely for the good of others. If we want to go into more like a futurist version of this could involve some sort of transhumanism. This could involve some sort of new man created through eugenics. Does this apply to MAGA? Not really. There is definitely an aspect of it that talks about kind of going back to like more traditional masculine or feminine principles and kind of a rejection of a lot of the developments in gender ideology and stuff like that. Not among all of them, obviously, because we have like Trump, who frequently talks about how the LGBTQ people love him. There is an aspect of this, but I'm just going to say no. It's basically just saying, for the most part, that this aspects of the sexual revolution have gone too far. It's like slightly right of center in the particular context, but we don't really see anything resembling what you would expect to see in a fascist regime. So for this, we're giving another goose egg. Okay, a nationalist foreign policy combined with an amoral, zero-sum, or realist conception of international affairs. This was one I had a lot of trouble wording. So basically the idea here is the foreign policy of the country is based almost entirely on the national self-interest, be that intervening in wars, staying out of wars, and things like ideology or international law or any of that stuff is kind of secondary. That's not to say you don't help out an ally, maybe, but the general assumption is that international relations is amoral. One state can only gain at the cost of other states, and the international system is anarchy, and the anarchy is what states make out of it. Now, this was implemented to kind of differentiate from neoconservatism, which is is a form of liberal internationalism, which is based on human rights and democracy, and to a certain extent, their own weird version of global government, where they reject the UN for not being liberal enough, and maybe kind of some more socialist ideology, where it's based more on spreading the ideology and making the world more socialist, even if there's not an immediate benefit. So they definitely get a point for this one. The Trump administration, the only war I think they really got in, I can't remember, was ISIS around before Trump got elected? I can't remember if they were or not. I think they were. But I guess Trump continued the war against ISIS and blew a bunch of ISIS guys up. He fired a couple missiles ineffectively at some Syrian air bases after telling them that he was going to do it. And then he withdrew from Afghanistan. I think Iraq was basically over at that point. Trump, if anything, went around and tried to make deals. Like, he tried to loosen tensions with North Korea. He was able to get a peace deal between Morocco and Israel. The Trumpian foreign policy is very much an American first one. Something you see a lot from his kind of supporters is, we're tired of fighting wars for the benefits of other countries. If America fights wars, it should be in the interests of America or in the interest of helping American allies. There's a general feeling that they're done being the world's policemen. They're done doing what the UN wants them to do. It's just time to move on. An indifference to or marginalization of economics. Very often, and I know this is a Mao quote, you have this conception of mind over matter or spirit over bullets or something like that in fascism. where the exact economic system isn't really that important. It can range from being free market to being mostly centrally planned and everything in between. Generally speaking, they tend to support some form of a mixed economy that leans a bit in the statist direction, some form of kind of state capitalism, where either industries are partially owned by the state or are owned by the state and you use a market method of distributing, or they're just very closely aligned with state goals. There's also an idea that like maybe protectionism's good, but it's not like it's just not particularly important. National regeneration and the national character are important. Economics is not. Does this apply to MAGA? No. MAGA and Trumpism is very much concerned with the economy. Particularly, I guess this is maybe an area where they have the most in common with, I guess, kind of more mainstreamy Republicans, even if they're more populist about it. There's drain the swamp. They want smaller government, less spending. Most of them want some form of a balanced budget. They want lower taxes, less foreign aid. And I guess you could say, generally speaking, they support protectionism, but that is like as a core economic idea. Like one of the core things that led to kind of MAGA or Trumpism is jobs being shipped overseas. So like the tariffs and the protectionist policies are not secondary. If anything, they're kind of primary. So economics is definitely a core concern of like the MAGA movement. So we're not going to give a point here. Oops. Okay, a masculine approach to problem solving, focusing on decisive action. So this is another thing that comes from the doctrine of fascism, and just fascism tends to be very masculine in its orientation. It tends to be, like I said, the new man. The new man is a man of action. He gets things done. He doesn't sit around and debate like democratic politicians. He's out there serving the country, beating his enemies, while everyone else is around debating and drinking tea and eating crumpets. And you see this within the context of like the New Order and Star Wars, where Palpatine says we're going to trade indecisiveness for strength, we're going to trade disunity for order, stuff like that. I would say it probably does apply. I'm not sure to give this a half a point or a full point. I'm gonna have to go with one because, like, the big approach, one of the big appeals for Trump is he's seen as this kind of like man of action. He's seen as this like alpha male who doesn't give a shit what people say or what people do. He's just going to go in there and get the job done, and it's going to be done the way he wants it to be done. And if anybody disagrees, he's going to steamroll them. Now, is that reality? No, not really. But that is kind of the way that they view themselves, and we're going by that. Okay, encouragement of mass political action, often in the form of a political party or other organization. Or other organizations, I should say. So, in some dictatorships, if anything, there's a desire for people to not be engaged in politics. That they want most people to be apolitical. The government might have a secret police force, but it's not like the ideology is kind of secondary. If there is any, there's generally like some vague nationalism or something. But generally speaking, in these societies, the state wants people to just focus on their business or whatever. And so long as they don't directly challenge the system, then that's good. Whereas in more totalitarian societies, you're encouraged to go join whatever the dominant party is. You're encouraged to directly participate, to protest, strike, stuff like that. Now, MAGA, I would say definitely they get a point for this one, because that's kind of, MAGA kind of grew out of the Tea Party, and that was kind of one of the main aspects of it, was this idea that professional politicians had failed. They sold everyone out to the banks. They sold the country out. They didn't do what the people wanted them to do. And so the common people have to get involved. They have to take back government for themselves. And this is something we've seen back to Andrew Jackson, and that's why people sometimes will draw comparisons between Trump and Andrew Jackson. Because there is very much a focus in MAGA, and you saw this with like the Million MAGA March and the Stop the Steal protesters or stuff like that, to try to get people to actively engage. Vanguardism, or the belief in an elite inner group to safeguard the new order slash revolution. This is once again a big no. If anything, it's very anti-elitist. It's very anti um, professional politician. Even when they're talking about people they like, they still want term limits for them. If anything, they mostly just want the government to leave them alone. They want a strong America, but an America in which the government is made smaller, and it actually does the things that they want it to do. This is very common in most fascist or communist states. You have some sort of inner circle, be they kind of your typical cabinet, be they the heads of the different intelligence services, the party officials, the personal family of the ruler, the highest level generals, something like that. But you definitely do not see that with MAGA. Okay, an often charismatic leader who wields absolute or near absolute power over the state or movement. Once again, this is kind of difficult because even though Hitler would definitely fit this criteria before the Nazi Party got elected, but he didn't hold absolute power over the country. He did, however, over the movement. So the leader isn't necessarily charismatic in the sense you'd maybe think of Hitler as being charismatic as a demagogue, but there is a clear leader of the movement who has some form of who's idealized to a certain extent, or certain characteristics are attributed to him that put him above and beyond other people, be it virtue, charisma, intelligence, judgment, authority, something like that. There's something about the leader that places him above other men. And this would definitely apply in this case because that's more or less what Trump is. Now, to be fair, like, people within MAGA will often disagree with Trump and not do what he says and stuff like that. But I do think that MAGA as a movement wouldn't exist without the force of Trump's personality. Okay, and then finally we have sublimation of the individual and individual rights into the interests of the group, party, or state. I think that's the right term. Basically, the idea is you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. If you need to assume full political control by banning the media, by arresting political dissidents, by taking away people's guns, by doing mass domestic spying, state terrorism, going around the normal legislative process, anything like that, then that's a sacrifice we're willing to make. That's okay. That's good. Now, is this a characteristic of MAGA? No. I mean, once again, this grew out of the Tea Party. This grew out of the people who were pissed off at Bush for the Patriot Act, for the NSA domestic spying, for being asked to contribute to endless wars that in no way benefited the American people. It's very much kind of an antithetical aspect to what MAGA was about. I guess you can say there's like some form of American nationalism, but a lot of these things are very relative. I mean, let's think about this for a minute. Who's more supportive of the government spying on people, arresting them without trial, and executing political dissidents? Is it the Trump Republicans or is it Antifa? I don't think I even really need to answer that one. So for this one, once again, MAGA gets 0. And that brings us to our scoring system. MAGA would have to get at least 10 points to be considered a fascist movement by this criteria, and it would need 8 or 9 points to be parafascist, or that is, the movement's not exactly fascist, but it definitely is kind of heading in that direction, or it has aspects of it. And going through MAGA, we got a grand total of 6 points. So it is halfway there. It's not even particularly close to being parafascist. And I think that's the thing that people don't really get about it. Well, Trump is the supposed radicalism of Trump mostly comes from the fact that he's an asshole who talks a really big game and just like hyperbolizes and plays stuff up and talks about how awesome he is and all the stuff he's going to do. But the underlying principle of it is pretty normal American conservatism. If anything, it's like what paleocons would say is a reversion away from the neoconservative interlopers towards something a bit more traditional or a bit more kind of conventional within conservatism. In the last 20 to 30 years have kind of been this like horrible nightmare um, that everybody's just kind of waking up from. There's nothing particularly radical or revolutionary in the sense that none of the stuff that Trump is proposing is really stuff that would have even been out of place in the 1990s. It's not like he's coming up with like some crazy we're going to switch the economy over to a social credit system or we're going to implement transhumanism or America's going to become a theocracy where the Catholic Church divides the country up into states that are ruled by a sovereign bishop or something like that. It's pretty kind of typical conservative populism, the kind of thing that you've had back since the days of the revolution. So I hope you found this series interesting. Post below what else you'd like me to cover. I'd like to do maybe the New Order from Star Wars next, because I've already done a video on it, and I think it'll probably check off every box on this list. So it might be interesting to have something like that just as a baseline of what like a purely idealized fascist government looks like. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless, and talk to you guys again real soon.